Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Life is becoming increasingly dangerous for people who oppose the regime of Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Rosario Murillo de Ortega. The government has arrested and even killed protesters, raided independent media outlets, jailed reporters, and shut down NGOs and human rights organizations since April of last year. Although he was once a hero of the Sandinista revolution, President Ortega has adopted many of the tactics of the regime he helped to overthrow. How and why did this happen? Joining us now are Julio Martinez Ellsberg, a co-coordinator of the International Relations Commission for the Nicaraguan Platform for Social Movements and Civil Society Organizations, both of which are part of the new blue and white national unity, and Nicaraguan historian Alejandro Bendaña, who served as ambassador to the United Nations and was Secretary General to the Nicaraguan Foreign Ministry during the first Sandinista government. His books include La Mística de Sandino and Power Lines, U.S. Hegemony in the New Global Order. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Let's begin with Julio. What happened on April 16th of last year?
So I'd say that towards late April, what you started seeing was that the accumulation of stress from the society towards the repression of freedom of speech over the past 10 years, the closure of all of these spaces for marching, spaces for speaking out, and for supporting opposition movements, came to a very critical moment when people started trying to protest social security reforms. And when those protests came out, it was mainly made up of the elderly and some young people. And on April 18th...
the government was raising Social Security taxes and lowering retirement payments? Does the government argue that it's strapped for cash?
Well, it was arguing that it was necessary, but we've been talking about Social Security for about 3 years. For 3 years, we knew that the money was running out, and we also knew the reasons for those running out. It was running out because administrative costs had doubled under this administration. It was also running out because of extremely non-transparent uses of the Social Security funds. So there had been complaints about this and but there was always an expectation that that there would be some sort of solution that didn't involve people having less income.
So on April 18th of last year, the government ordered the police to use live ammunition to stop the protests?
So on April 18th, they asked what they normally have are gangs. A group of about 40 people went and repressed those protests. It was all on Facebook Live, essentially. They beat people up with clubs, and so by the end of the day, you had elderly and young people bloodied by these paramilitary forces.
Now, Alejandro, protests are not unknown to Nicaragua. Weren't there protests by environmentalists earlier in that month?
Yes, it was almost coincidental, and it was focused, interestingly enough, on the students. The students were the conscience of the nation, in many senses, but particularly in the environmental one, because just in the 10 days that preceded the April 18th civic explosion, there had been a series of rallies and student organizing because a biological reserve was on fire, and the government was just sort of sitting on the sides watching it and refusing international and Costa Rican support to put out that fire, which was killing the biodiversity. So it was and that came on top of the Social Security crisis as Julio has mentioned, the students went out of the universities into the streets, and the regime freaked out and ordered the police to begin to repress furiously. So it wasn't like police incidents; it was a systematic policy that only grew worse and worse.
And an estimated 322 people have been killed since the protests began. You've known Ortega for many years. Are you surprised by the tactics he's taken recently? Has he abandoned his image as a hero of the revolution?
First part of the question, yes, I have to admit that I was surprised. I mean, I'd known him. I worked with him closely throughout the 80s. And he's an aggressive person, isolated, definitely an authoritarian bent that came out of his years in prisons and years in the guerrilla movement. But had you asked me 9 months ago whether this regime was actually capable of systematically shooting unarmed civilians, I would have said no. This aspect of criminality is one of the dimensions of not only the change in Mr. Ortega as a personality, but indeed the whole transfiguration of what was the Sandinista revolution's ethos and ideals into something degenerate, which we in Nicaragua call Orteguismo, the Ortega governing regime, increasingly authoritarian in many senses, yet neoliberal in its economic policy, which I suppose is also aggressive. But this criminality that just went over the top.
Now
so
you say
it was definitely a break.
You say it's a neoliberal economic policies. Wasn't Ortega seen as a man of the left? Has he changed? Is correct. But if we examine the way he got elected, it was by making compromises and with the corporate big business as well as with the church and other sectors. The people that ran the economic policy, people forget this now, from when he came back to power from 2008 until March of this year was essentially the banking sector. They had never had it so good. And the IMF and the World Bank gave Ortega just shining letters of approval that he could do this. Also was that was part of his governing alliance, and they said, and he could be authoritarian. Yet the business sector was happy until April, where he could no longer deliver stability either to the U.S. or to the business sector, and then the matter changed. Julio, how did the public react to the events of April 18th? Did they protest further, or were they afraid because people had been killed?
It was absolute outrage, indignation. I mean, the first protest for Social Security, it was several hundred people. It was not small, but it wasn't massive. But it was when people started seeing just the impunity of young people and the elderly being beat up, was that the next day it had multiplied. So by April 19th, it was massive. And then the repression in April 19th was much worse, and that's where lots of live ammunition was used. And on the 20th, it had multiplied even more to the point where, but so it just kept increasing.
And where were you when the violence broke out?
The first 5 days, I wasn't there. I was actually outside of the country. And then I arrived on the 6th day. And from the 6th day on, I was part of of everything, of the protests, of the marches, of the organizing, of everything else.
As I said in my introduction, you're a member of the Blue and White National Unity. What's that?
So first group that we're part of is the Platform for Social Movements and Civil Society Organizations. which brings together social movements that existed prior to April, which includes the peasant movement, feminist movement, anti-mining movement, everyone that was working at grassroots. And then that comes together with the new social movements that existed after April. So the student movement didn't exist before April, and that's part of it. And now, say, all the social movements and all the other organizations that have organized around the, to make a kind of counterweight to Ortega, are now part of the Blue and White National Unity.
And do all of these different groups share an ideology?
One, democracy, an end to the repression, a need for transition, and justice for what's happened.
And are its members at risk for participating?
Yes, absolutely. That's why there's many thousands of people that are now in exile. There are 800.
They're going mostly to Costa Rica, aren't they? Are
Right.
any of them in these groups that are coming north that Donald Trump is so worried about?
There were some people that were part of those caravans that, yes, they were fleeing from Nicaragua. It wasn't a large group. The largest group has gone to Costa Rica. There's an estimate of about 50,000 that have gone to Costa Rica, and then smaller numbers in Honduras and Guatemala.
The government raided the offices of Vilma Núñez, the head of the Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights. Why does it fear a human rights NGO?
Because they are the most respected, say, witnesses. There are people that are extremely respected. Vilma Núñez is an old-time Sandinista, extremely respected on the left, extremely respected in international human rights groups, and so practically untouchable. So, but they fear them. Her organization was closed down, and the other human rights organizations have gone into exile.
They revoked her license as well. There are no NGOs who are monitoring the situation anymore?
All the strongest NGOs in the environmental and the human rights aspect on freedom of speech, all of them are being shut down. All the main ones, and then the other ones are being coerced in other ways if they haven't been shut down. And their people are being sent to jail, along with reporters. Plenty of them.
We're talking about the current situation in Nicaragua with Julio Martinez Ellsberg and Alejandro Bendaña. This is Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI, New York, 99.5 FM. Alejandro, hasn't the Organization of American States and the UN sent investigators to Nicaragua to look into human rights abuses?
Yes, both of their specialized organs, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, as well as the High Commissioner of the UN for Human Rights, had sent missions. The Inter-American Human Rights Commission was, in addition, organized a group of independent special experts to carry out investigations. This was one of the few demands that Ortega reluctantly gave into to allow their presence. But in time, they've all been thrown out. Just literally almost put on a plane. And why? Because their reports, independent of each other, are devastating to the regime. From the whole allegations that there was a coup involved, and that the demonstrators were a bunch of drug addicts, and that they were all armed, and the poor police were running for their lives. And they talked to hundreds of witnesses, reviewed videos, and all of this is online, and brought it back to the OAS. And it's now going to the Human Rights Commission in Geneva. And the strongest indictment was that by the independent group which worked for the OAS actually came out and concluded Ortega and his principal cohort should be investigated for crimes against humanity. That is, the regime. That's the basis for saying, they didn't say it, but it's what it means, that the regime is illegitimate.
Zaid Rad al-Hussein, High Commissioner for Human Rights, said the repression and violence, quote, are products of the systematic erosion of human rights over the years, and highlight the overall fragility of institutions and the rule of law. And the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has listed a number of serious events which they say are aimed at dissuading the population from publicly demonstrating in protests and criminalizing social protests in Nicaragua. What has the Ortega administration's response been to those charges?
Oh, it's totally in denial, and now it's saying it's just part of a huge international conspiracy led by the United States to discredit the poor, is anti-imperialist government of Nicaragua. It's all supposed to be a plot, but we who are in Nicaragua and who have lived under this government know better. Ortega was never anti-imperialist until he only discovered the rhetoric in the last 2 months. And yes, the commissions are right that this was part of accumulation. You have to remember that Ortega controls all the powers of the state, the judiciary, the legislature, the attorney general. So if you try to go anywhere and get justice in Nicaragua, and this was pre-April, it's gotten worse now, there was nowhere to go. The whole system is rigged, and it extended down into controlling the universities, the municipalities, and making NGOs and political associations, including the second political force in the country, which was the Liberal Party. One day he decided they were illegal and shut them down. So it's the accumulation of a pattern, and all of this is of course contradictory to civil and political human rights.
Julio, didn't the Nicaraguan National Police declare that protest demonstrations are illegal and they hold organizers criminally responsible?
Yes, so they did that.
You go to jail for protesting?
Well, many of the 800 people that are in jail right now for political reasons were simply marching at the time. And this number keeps growing by about 100 every month. So that's the state right now. They say when somebody from the international community asked them, well, I heard that protests are illegal, they said, no, somebody could submit a request if they wanted. Well, we took them on that and submitted several requests, but all of them were rejected, saying that that's part of the coup.
But this past October, your Blue and White National Unity organized a United for Freedom March. Was that technically an illegal protest?
The protest that was organized in October, everybody that showed up at, say, 9 a.m. was arrested, and they were kept in jail for 36 hours. There hasn't been, since that law was passed, there hasn't been a single protest that has not been shut down.
Journalists also arrested.
Oh, yeah. Some of the main journalists, a lot of them also ancient Sandinistas, are not only arrested but are in solitary confinement because the Ortega regime sees them as such an important kind of witness and influencer.
Were you arrested?
I was not arrested.
The OAS report divides the repression into 3 phases, and the initial phase, they write, was, quote, characterized by the state's repressive reply to public demonstrations and by protests spreading across the country in different formats, including barricades and roadblocks. And then the second stage, from mid-June to mid-July, quote, saw the forcible removal of roadblocks and barricades by state authorities and pro-government armed elements. So what were some of the tactics used to remove those barricades and roadblocks? Did you witness any of that?
I wasn't at when the attack, well, I was during one of the attacks at the university, actually. It was military style tactics. So you have several, military groups that show up at the roadblock and simply with high caliber weapons, including snipers, start shooting and killing until you undo the roadblock.
Alejandro, the OAS third phase is something we talked about, the criminalization and persecution of those who participated in the demonstrations. United Nations, which you used to be a member of, reports that security forces have carried out extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. Who are they targeting?
They're targeting primarily the leaders of what were the active resistance youth in the countryside as well as in the cities. Because after they crushed the barricades and people fled, then they came exactly the other stage where they went after them, then after the journalists, after the NGOs, after the human rights organizations, but they went after them in an immediate period with a viciousness, which was to in the countryside they were killed and that was the army, and you hardly heard anything. In the cities they were just picked up. So the number of people in jail, which we call political prisoners, are indeed over 800. And yes, there are hundreds. We don't know what happened to them. There's talks of common graves that exist somewhere, and that where people were taken out by the police and by para-police organizations. But they're forcing so many to flee to Costa Rica. So they've been crushed. They are in jail, and that's one of the demands right now is that these people that were illegally detained, the vast majority have not gone before a judge. Some of them are indefinite solitary containment. They were denied access for a long time to lawyers and even to family visits to medicines, and some European Parliament deputies that came were actually the only ones that were able to go in there and talk to them and gave witness to them. So what our movement is demanding that if we're going to talk about dialogue, Ortega, you have to release the political prisoners now. You have to let the exiled people come back freely. It's not a matter of going back to what existed in March, but we're talking about ending the injustice and constructing justice by way of a transitional justice process. Because what the mothers of those that killed are demanding and the political prisoners are demanding is a process of truth, of justice, of reparations and guarantees of non-repetition.
What's the impact of all of this been on the economy?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, last year the economy contracted by about 4%, and this year, if things continue the way that they are going now, it's expected to contract by another 10%. That means that poverty is definitely going up. There are about 400,000 Nicaraguans who have lost their jobs, and remember, this is a population of 6 million. No, it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating, especially to the poorest Nicaraguans.
And the economy is what? Basically the same economy that was during the period when Ortega was out of power, or has he changed things at all? Because conservatives in this country kind of lump Nicaragua with Venezuela and say that they're both socialist countries. Is Ortega's policy, or is Ortega a socialist?
No, absolutely nothing of his policies are socialist in any way. If you look at his, starting with education policy, it's the exact same percentage of investment in education that it was during the right-wing governments that came before it. In terms of Social Security, he devastated that. He had some social programs that he paid for with, say, Venezuelan oil money, but they were, distributed in a very corrupt way, in a way to promote the patronage, and they dried up as soon as the loans ran out. And in terms of, say, taxes, he never reformed any taxes so that there would be any kind of equal distribution from the richer to the poor. he didn't carry out anything that you would say is progressive.
From the vantage point of your generation, are there any values of the Sandinista revolution that you still support and would like to reclaim?
Look, there are a lot of people that have been part of the protests that come from Sandinista families and that might still consider themselves Sandinista. I would even argue that, I mean, we'll see this afterwards, but easily 50% of the people that have been protesting value that movement. And much of what we're doing today, the people that value that movement see what we're doing today as part of it. I mean, this is, an anti-dictatorial movement. It's a movement pro-justice in your country, and it's a movement anti-political elite, which is what's happened right now. What we have is a small group of Orteguistas that decide how they use every single institution in the government, the same way that Somoza did. So we definitely see plenty of parallels.
Interestingly, we did a show a couple of months back about how women who had played a major role in the Sandinista revolution were all pretty much pushed out of positions of power.
Sure.
So is this mostly how important is Rosario Murillo, the wife of Daniel Ortega?
She's pretty much like a co-president. I mean, she's extremely important to him. I mean, during the revolution, though, she is not at the same level as all those people that were pushed out. Mm-hmm. All of those guerrilla leaders, like Dora Maria Tellez and Monica Altodano, or the intellectuals, or all of these women who were leading ministries. Lea Guido Yocondabelli all these women that were also in this new this documentary that came out recently mm-hmm. About the Sandinista women. All of those women have been pushed out.
Alejandro, who's Carlos Fernando Chamorro?
Carlos Fernando is the most prominent journalist in Nicaragua, with widely respected and internationally well known. He was the recipient of the Cabot Moore Prize in Colombia. He comes from a Sandinista background. He, like I, held important positions in the Sandinista revolution, but in the mid-1970s, we were part of a dispersed movement that began to break with the regime, that is, when it was in opposition with Ortega and with the Sandinista party in response to the sustained authoritarian way he wanted to control the Sandinista party. So now Chamorro had a regular program which was totally opposition, and it's totally opposition because at that time you couldn't get government people to go on a show and actually have a debate. They would boycott it. Well, the point is that about 3 weeks ago, they just simply raided his private offices, threw everybody out, and confiscated the premises and shut down his whole operation. The guy, his life was threatened when he tried to protest rather valiantly and simply ask why, or where was the warrant, where was the arrest, and he was abused by police, and shortly thereafter, he and his family left for Costa Rica, and now they broadcast, as do others, from Costa Rica or other places, but you can only pick them up now on the social media. So we who are left in Nicaragua are also being strangled by the steady shutdown of independent journalism. It's a huge issue, and there is at least 50 journalists who are in jail, including some of the most prominent, such as Miguel Mora, who spent 30 days at least in solitary confinement, along with his news director. Both stellar journalists who were guilty of the crime of broadcasting and being independent, reporting independently on what was taking place on the streets and on a political level.
He said, "This is a criminal government responsible for crimes and the massive violation of human rights. This is the worst crisis in our history." Worse than under Somoza. Didn't Somoza's dictatorship have his father assassinated 40 years ago?
It did. The Somoza dictatorship had another dynamics, and we fought against it. And and it came down to a military confrontation. But even I can remember that even in Somoza's time, you could guerrilla leaders, opposition leaders. Yes, they were jailed, but then they could go to court and they could have a hearing, and they could have defense attorneys. And the press was, you had 2 or 3 or 4 press organs which were totally open. So in that sense, this dictatorship is worse than the one that we overthrew, with the exception perhaps that the guy actually went to war with his U.S. trained and organized army against the military movement, which was the Sandinista Front, and 55,000 lives were lost. We don't want that repeated in Nicaragua again, which is why a fundamental principle of the blue and white unity, as well as the social movement's platform, is that no matter how much we're pushed, our struggle will be peaceful and civic, and which is why we need as much as international solidarity as possible, because it's that sort of push which will put Ortega against the ropes and force him first into a dialogue, and secondly, bring about the end of his presidency instead of prolonging this crisis until 2021, when the next elections are scheduled to take place.
We're talking about the current situation in Nicaragua with Alejandro Bendaña, who was the ambassador to the United Nations and Secretary General to the Nicaraguan Foreign Ministry during the first Sandinista government, and with Julio Martinez Ellsberg, co-coordinator of the International Relations Commission for the Nicaraguan Platform for Social Movements and Civil Society Organizations. And we are returning now to our 2 guests, Julio Martinez Ellsberg and Alejandro Bendaña, talking about the current situation in Nicaragua. Alejandro, you were very much a part of the Sandinista government in the 1980s when you served as its main spokesperson to the United States. Wasn't U.S. policy very much anti-Sandinista?
To the United Nations, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, people, they go back that far. I had to deal with the Reagan administration, the Jean Kirkpatrick's. It was virtual war. And by the way, we had to deal with Elliot Abrams, who now has made somewhat of a comeback for Venezuela. They could have picked a nicer guy who knows more about clandestine war and trying to change regimes. So yes, my history and the Sandinista history is not one that has been exactly that enjoyed the best relations with the U.S. So we're not unaware of sometimes we're accused of not knowing how the U.S. and imperialism actually works.
In the 1980s, the U.S. ordered an economic blockade and funded the Contras. And now the president said in his State of the Union address that he hasn't entirely ruled out military intervention in Venezuela.
Well, this is a problem, it's interesting because I get a kick out of the fact that both the extreme right and the orthodox left in the U.S. and elsewhere make exactly the same argument that that it is a parallel between Venezuela and Nicaragua. But if a Wall Street Journal article is that it's quoted someone in the administration saying that Trump is bent on cleaning up, whatever that means, Latin America, and then we're in trouble. And if he shows an inclination for military intervention, this is followed. This does not help us who are fighting the dictatorial regime in Nicaragua. We don't want that sort of help. Our situation is different from that of Venezuela. The U.S., yes, of course, it's at work defending its own interest in Venezuela as in every country, and it's doing so in Nicaragua too, in a different way. They hedge their bets. They're angry at Ortega because Ortega can no longer deliver stability, and they would like to put, their own version of Juan Guaido's in power in Managua. But our blog movement, even though it does contain right-wing elements, at least the articulation is true to its justice and social transformation platform, and it is dead set against military intervention. And we are not dreaming of getting into this ridiculously dangerous situation that you have in Venezuela. You're going to have two presidents calling each other the illegal, two Supreme Courts, two attorney generals, and what are you going to get? Two armies, and therefore a war? That's not the way we're going.
Julio, how supportive are the majority of Nicaraguans to the Ortega government? Do long-term Sandinistas continue to express loyalty to the president?
So we can measure that in different ways. There was a survey that showed, the most recent survey after they were also repressed, showed that 80% of Nicaraguans are ready for early elections. There was a 20%.
But that's been ruled out by the Ortega government.
Completely ruled out. Well, actually, they had offered it when they were talking to the OAS early on, but they've ruled it out now. So there is a strong interest in early elections. And bear in mind that, like I mentioned earlier, much of the places that presented the strongest resistance to Ortega were in Masaya and León and all these Sandinista bastions. And that's where a lot of the prisoners came from as well.
Phone videos of the government violence made their way online around the world. Has that forced President Ortega to change any of his tactics?
He hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed since about August is that there's less shooting directly. He saw that was bringing a lot of attention to him. So instead, he does arbitrary arrests with torture and forcing people into exile. More so but the first several months were, shoot to kill. Seizing
protesters at night from their homes.
Absolutely. At any moment in any neighborhood, they'll do it on the basis of surveillance of your social media. They'll do it on rumors. They will not use any kind of warrant. They will beat you up in the process. I mean, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights calls it a state of exception, meaning that there's absolutely no rule of law. And you will not see your family, you will not see a lawyer, you will not see daylight as well, since many of them are in solitary confinement.
Alejandro, the Sandinistas of the 1980s served as a model revolutionary society for Latin America. Land reform, a massive literacy campaign, health and education for all. And then they lost power in 1989, voted out of power, so I guess not everybody appreciated what they were trying to do. And then there was a conservative and neoliberal rule for 15 years. How different were the Sandinistas when they returned to power in 2006? Had they changed their goals?
Absolutely, and it was no longer the Sandinistas. I mean, we like to believe that the real Sandinistas are out on the street. The big difference was that by 2006, Ortega and his wife had captured total control of the party. In many senses, the Sandinista party ceased to exist in a regular party sense, but it was just a apparatus that was run by both of them, and he was hell-bent, determined to get back into office and sacrifice any claims to social justice and transformation. Of course, it was also a backlog from the 80s, because the 80s, along with the positive dimensions that you mentioned, also came a huge amount of mistakes in economic policy, and then, of course, the war itself, which just brought out, so to speak, the worst features out in the Sandinista front itself. We now recognize and talk about that, so that the results of the February 1990 elections, where the Sandinista lost with about 42%. The question then became, how the hell did we get that high in the light of everything that was taking place? But Ortega was determined to come back to power, and the first thing he did was, I'm going to make an alliance with the Catholic Church, I'm going to reach an understanding with the U.S., and I'm going to go into partnership with big business. And he cut a deal with the Arnoldo Aleman, which laid the basis for his coming back, where they lowered the threshold of what percentage you needed to get to win a presidential election. So he actually won the election in 2006 in a dubious manner, with a less of a percentage of which he had lost 16 years earlier. But you have an illegitimacy at birth in 2006, which was not the case in the 80s. In the 80s, there was a process of losing legitimacy, but you started off with a massive support. Now it's been a contrary process. Some have benefited, some remain loyal, but the Sandinista front as an organization is like a skeleton without any meat on it, and it's essentially the government. It's not even outside of the party, but people that depend on the state, that form part of the administration, and has the okay of the army, and the police is totally controlled from the presidential offices.
Now, Julio, were you born when Ortega was in power the first time?
Yeah, I was born in 1985.
So, in a sense, most of your life you've lived in a post-Sandinista world.
That's
Do
right.
people of your generation have nostalgia for the goals of the old Sandinista revolution?
Okay, I would say, let's see, and kind of following up on what Alejandro was saying. I mean, there is a recognition that the Sandinista revolution ended, say, in 1990. I think a lot of young people who were interested in social justice and whose parents did not leave the party, they might consider that was the way to continue thinking about social justice. Other people who thought that the Sandinista revolution was a much broader based thing that had certain principles that now this government was violating, maybe there was some nostalgia, especially for the first maybe year of that kind of sentiment of Sandinismo. But they noticed very early on that this government was violating that. So I do think there's a division, I think, still within kind of society. But the main thing is that young people do make a strong difference between what was the project that was there in the 80s and what's happening now, and want to have that conversation separately.
Alejandro, given the long history of U.S. intervention in Nicaragua's Central and South America in general, do you see any positive role for the United States in the current context?
No. It would be separate if we talk about the United States as a people. I mean, even back to Sandino's time, there was a solidarity movement 90 years ago when the U.S. Marines actually occupied the country and set up the first Somoza dictatorship. And there are people in Congress that are decent enough. Of course, there's always this sort of imperial sense of fulfilling a manifest destiny, and sort of you got to control Central America. You got to, we're the dominant power, and the Monroe Doctrine and all of that. But if the Trump administration is unpredictable. It could even do sometimes the right things for the wrong reasons, as in Korea. But every country it has its own interest, and they would like to see a full restoration of capitalist rule. We can't make any mistake about that. So that it's not simply a question of, we get rid of Ortega, and the U.S. will probably be relieved at that. But then will come the real political struggle. Okay, what is the type of Nicaragua that we want to build? And here, the youth movement, which Julio and others represent, have some real definite ideas that begin with the premise that we're no going back to business as usual.
President,
business as usual. Go ahead.
President Trump signed a bill that curbs Nicaragua's access to international development banks. Is that a positive step?
It's a controversial step, and I personally am not that comfortable with it. But Ortega, we know, is using development project money to help his budget and funds police and repressive apparatus. So in that sense, it has to be closed. Now, what I understand from the legislation is that it is expected that this should not affect everyday average Nicaraguans, because then sanctions become, as they have in Venezuela, become counterproductive. If this can have a foreign exchange impact, then that just may, and if it were accompanied by sanctions from other countries, because the worst thing that can happen is what's taking place as regards Venezuela, that this is posed as a U.S.-Nicaraguan contest as opposed to a struggle between opposing forces in Nicaragua itself.
Isn't the Organization of American States moving to revoke Nicaragua's membership?
Not yet, but they're trying to gather sufficient number of votes they would need 24 votes to do that, and they would have to convene an extraordinary special movement. But there's at least 16 countries that are recommending a series of sanctions. The European Union is also contemplating the sanctions, because Ortega has to be isolated not only nationally but internationally too.
Now, Julio, we don't have much time, but didn't you organize a speaking tour of Nicaraguan activists to travel to 9 cities in the United States in September and October?
Yeah.
What was the purpose of that tour?
The purpose is that there were enough people in the U.S. that were still debating as to whether Ortega was somehow a progressive who was under attack, and so we said, well, say that somebody who's been on the ground, who's been attacked by these people and other people and activists who have been kind of fighting for civil rights in Nicaragua for the past 10 years. So we brought somebody from the student movement, somebody from the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua who's been dealing with repression for the past 10 years. Myself, who've been part of this movement. And
that's from the indigenous people on the coast, aren't they?
From the Afro-Nicaraguan community.
Yeah.
And so we went around to have one-on-one conversations, ask us any questions completely open, and see if that kind of contributes to this conversation.
And you testified before Congress?
I also testified before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission.
And what was the response there?
The response was, it was mainly, we know that's where Democratic or Progressive Caucus, that's who they listen to. And so we wanted to make sure that the Progressive Caucus had the right information. So we went to go talk to them. The Progressive Caucus, during those days, put out a communique denouncing the Ortega government. And I think that, essentially it got a lot more people from the Democratic side on our side.
Do you think, I throw this out to both of you, and I have no time left, but do you think that there's going to be armed rebellion? Because there was, of course, the Sandinista rebellion was an armed rebellion.
There's no leadership within the current movement that is calling for violence. We know how that turns out. We have a recent experience in the Civil War. It's always a call for nonviolent resistance. Now, we have to also point out that there's a lot of people that are extremely frustrated right now, especially people who are in exile. And some people might take actions that we don't agree with. And so we don't think it'll turn in that direction, but we have to be conscious of that tension that this is causing. But no, I don't think that it'll be an armed conflict.
And I assume you agree, Alejandro?
I agree with that. We certainly don't hope for that. And there has been a conscientious decision, because if people haven't taken up weapons, it's not because they don't have weapons. Most Nicaraguan households do, and in the countryside, it's even worse. So what has to be commended is the actual decision, the commitment to not to do it in that way. Of course, the repression would be immediate, and the police goes around asking if people raiding homes that they think that they have guns. But so far peaceful. But civil protest and nonviolence, we do know will only get you so far.
My great thanks to both of you, Alejandro Bendaña and Julio Martinez Ellsberg. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Leonard.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our show. My great thanks to Susie Stoltz, who produced this segment, to Elena Orengo and Steve Hellinger for their invaluable input, to Reggie Johnson, who is at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my executive producer, Jesse Lent. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.